Hey guys, what's up? It's filtersc here, and I'm back for another video. This time I want to talk about the fundamental rule of Starcraft 2 and how you can utilize that to start getting better as a better players, how you can use that to start getting better in multiplayer, and how you can kind of eliminate a lot of the frustration you might feel when you're starting to play the game. And the fundamental rule of Starcraft 2, no matter what league you're in really, is just it's all about how much you can build and how well you can utilize what you do build. It is not ever really about building X to beat Y. Although that can play a factor, it really doesn't matter until you start getting to a super high level of play where you need to start thinking about that kind of stuff. It's all about building a lot of stuff and then being able to utilize it really well. If you can't do that on a simple level, you're going to have a really hard time, and you need to not put your focus on being able to beat, X or Y with, the specific counter unit and that kind of stuff. The vast majority of StarCraft 2 is played with kind of a core basic composition that you're going to want to utilize, and your opponent probably knows what you're going to try to play with in terms of your own unit selection. That means neither of you are really building to counter each other, you're both just building what in general is good. Then what happens is other more supportive units come into play that kind of take over and finish off your composition, but that really doesn't matter until you start getting to a super high level of play. You can get to the highest possible league in StarCraft 2 with nothing but the most basic units. You can make it all the way to GM with basically nothing but Marines, basically nothing but Stalkers, and basically nothing but Roaches. It's a perfectly viable thing to do. So what does that mean? Well, that means it really doesn't matter if you're able to, build X or Y to beat all this different stuff. You don't need to think about that. What you need to focus on is just really building a lot of stuff, and you need to work on that as early as possible because it's one of the fastest paths that you're going to have to improvement. It's the most important thing you need to know, and it's the best way you can start improving. So, with that being said, let's talk a little bit more detail about why that is and why that kind of makes StarCraft 2 pretty special. And the first thing is, macro really is the defining factor in skill for the majority of the player base. Now, this is going to sound like a negative thing, and what macro is it's just the ability to make a lot of stuff. It's your ability to make a lot of Marines, it's your ability to build an effective base, make a lot of workers, whatever they may be, drones, Protoss, doesn't matter. That is what is the defining factor in your skill level. Now, what's cool about that, though, is if you look at the whole ladder, almost everybody is based off their macro. So what happens is when you go in UQ and you play against your opponent or whatever, you're both going to have relatively even macro. And what that means is things like strategy, multitask, and micro start to come into play within the game that you're currently playing. However, if you play somebody who's quite a bit better than you, they're just going to beat you with pure macro. And that's kind of the thing that you need to remember when you're looking to improve, and get better at the game, is well, you might have a game that is relatively even against your opponent, and it might come down to you having better micro, or your opponent having better micro, or maybe your strategy is a little better, or whatever. The reality is macro is the best way to improve. It's the most relevant, right? So you need to kind of forget about a lot of that different stuff when you are playing and you are trying to get better, because it really isn't super relevant towards ranking up. You could have a really, really good strategy, but if your macro is just not up to the task in terms of execution, it's not going to work that often. You can be really, really good at micro, but it's not going to be that relevant if you really can't macro at all, because your opponent's just going to have more stuff. Now, it doesn't matter if you're picking off his High Templar and stuff like that, if he just has enough of them to storm your whole army, right? That's what you really need to remember, is it really is all about the macro when you're trying to get better and you're trying to improve. Yes, the other things play a factor, and they will play a factor in your games. Don't forget that. It doesn't mean that they're useless, but they're not that important when you are trying to get better in the long run, right? So with that being said, like I said, macro is the fastest path to improvement. It's also the easiest one to measure, and that's kind of the most important thing that a lot of people forget about. You can try to get better at micro, and you can try to get better at multitask, but you cannot measure those effectively within a game. And multitask and micro are two things that are severely misunderstood by the vast majority of the player base, and they're also something the vast majority of the player base simply doesn't do very well. A lot of players, when it comes to things like micro, actually over micro and make their units function worse than they would have otherwise. And it's actually not uncommon, all the way through even up into Diamond and Masters League that you'll see players just heavily over microing when there's better things that they could be doing. You know, one of the biggest things you'll see when you watch a professional player play when it comes to micro is they'll micro the start of a fight, unless it's like a super late game one that is incredibly important. But almost every other fight, they're going to micro the start of it, get all your units in really good positions, kind of set up their attack, and then they're going to look away from the fight and go back and macro. Or they're going to look away from the fight and go look at a drop or something like that, right? And that's where a lot of players start to fail, is they just stare at a fight and move their units around when their units really aren't doing anything more effective than they would be otherwise. So multitask and micro are two things that are really misunderstood. The other thing about micro is, like I said before, micro is not just splitting your Marines. Micro is not just, you know, casting a few abilities like force field here and there. That really isn't micro. That's like core basic stuff to just be, you know, being able to play the game on a simple level. Even things like stutter step and stuff like that are just like, they're really basic, and they play a factor and they start to come into play, but they're really not the majority of micro. The majority of micro is all done with, you know, really, really good mouse control. It's pulling and spreading units out. It's, you know, when you're moving and you're fighting, it's making sure that your units are always firing and dealing their maximum amount of damage when your opponent's units maybe are slightly out of position or unable to. And this is why you're going to start to, you know, as you get better and better and better, you're going to see players that are able to get more and more out of their units. Yeah, there's some very basic micro situations out there that a lot of players are going to look at and be like, oh man, that's hard for me. And it still gets, you know, that stuff's still hard all the way through until the highest level of play. But you don't start seeing the really good micro where, you know, the vast majority of the units are firing, things are getting focus fired, stuff that you can't even see on a replay. You won't be able to see it on a replay. You can only see it when you go watch a super high level player stream, right? And it's all about mouse movement, shuffling things around, being able to get the most out of your units. A player with really good micro in that type of situation is going to obliterate a player who just doesn't really have that aspect of their game tuned up. However, you're not going to start seeing that until you get to, you know, basically GM level. And it's really important you understand that, you know, a lot of players will say they have really good micro, but they don't. It's like, I don't mean to be rude about it, but like 99 point whatever percent of the player base really can't micro or multitask very effectively at all, even if some players say and think that they can. So it's really important to work on your macro and focus on that, because that's the most important aspect of the game, and it really is the fundamental rule. You don't need to worry about, you know, having god tier micro. You don't need to worry about having all these different skills line up for you. You don't need to worry about strategically making the right units. One of the best players at the end of Heart of the Swarm against Protoss wasn't making Ghosts and he wasn't making Vikings in the matchup. He just didn't even bother. He said, I can beat you with my control over these more basic units, right? And that's breaking, you know, one of the biggest things with RTS games, and one of the biggest misconceptions of Starcraft 2 is that the most important thing you need to remember is just, if you can use your units really well and you can make a lot of them, you're going to be in really good shape. So you don't need to worry about X beating Y outside of a few very situational things, but the majority of the time you're already going to have a lot of that stuff built into your composition or your strategy that you're already going for. Anyway guys, this is filtersc. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I know it's a little bit of a goofy one or complex kind of thought process in getting there, but I wanted to put this out there just so people can kind of start to understand that, hey, like, you know, if I want to get better, I really do have to sit back and look at my macro and make sure I'm spending all my money, make sure it's, you know, being spent the right way, make sure it's effective. And I'm not going to worry too much about all this engagement stuff because it's actually not super relevant to the game. Not just yet anyway. You'll get there in time, but remember, it takes a long time to build those skills. I'm filtersc, and I'll see you guys next time.